T.E. Lawrence, more widely known as Lawrence of Arabia, stands as a truly legendary figure of the 20th century. This iconic status perhaps explains the persistent inquiries surrounding the man himself. To some, he was a daring archaeologist who emerged as a staunch friend to the Arab people during a period of conflict. However, others view Lawrence as ultimately becoming an agent of the British Empire, purportedly betraying a cause he once vowed to defend at any cost. During the Great War, when Lawrence and his Arabian allies successfully captured Damascus, liberating the city from the Ottoman Empire, they were celebrated as heroes. Yet upon locating his old friend King Faisal within the city hall, Lawrence's initial jubilation instantly vanished. Thomas Edward Lawrence, later known as Lawrence of Arabia, was born in 1888, the second child of Sir Thomas Chapman and Sarah Junner. His birth was considered scandalous because Junner had been the governess to Chapman's daughters before they eloped. Seeking to evade the judgmental eyes of their former community, Chapman and Junner relocated from Ireland to Wales, adopting the surname Lawrence. The family moved throughout Britain multiple times during Lawrence's early years, eventually settling in Oxford in 1896. This relocation proved to be a pivotal point for the intellectually inclined young Lawrence. Despite his fondness for books, his passion for In 1907, Lawrence gained admission to Jesus College, Oxford, majoring in history. At university, Lawrence became known for his captivating storytelling and his inclination for practical jokes, often scaling walls and towers around the town. In the summer of 1908, Lawrence embarked on a bicycle tour of France, cycling as far as the Mediterranean and exploring numerous Roman sites, along with churches and castles. The photographs and mementos he collected on this journey would form the basis of his undergraduate thesis, which focused on Crusader castles and earned high academic praise. However, he soon conceived an even grander idea, an archaeological expedition to the Middle East. He approached David Hogarth, a highly accomplished archaeologist who had been impressed by Lawrence's earlier discoveries in the local region. However, upon learning of Lawrence's plans for a summer trip to the Middle East to study Crusader castles, Hogarth advised against it, citing the dangerous climate and political instability. Despite this discouragement, Lawrence remained resolute and insisted on undertaking his Middle Eastern journey during the intense summer heat, even planning to travel on foot. Arriving in Beirut, Lawrence walked 20 miles daily on his trek to reach northern Syria. He was affable and approachable, consistently finding food and lodging without difficulty thanks to his charisma and growing proficiency in Arabic. However, his journey was not without its perils. On one occasion, a man on horseback fired a rifle at Lawrence. Undaunted, Lawrence returned fire with his pistol, startling the rider who then fled. In another incident, a thief attempting to steal Lawrence's watch struck him on the head with a rock and absconded with several of his belongings. Local villagers later apprehended the thief, and Lawrence eventually returned to England unharmed, but with a deeper understanding of the region's social and political complexities. In 1911, Lawrence once again traveled to the Middle East with his colleague Professor Hogarth for an excavation in northern Syria. It was during this period that he encountered a local Syrian teenager named Salim Ahmed, whom he nicknamed Dahum. Recognizing the boy's intelligence, Lawrence began tutoring him in mathematics and English, while Dahum, in turn, assisted Lawrence in improving his Arabic. While there is no definitive proof that their relationship was ever physical, Lawrence's later writings hinted at the profound affection he held for the boy. Lawrence and Dahum often journeyed together and were once mistaken for deserters from the Turkish army. According to Lawrence's account, they were even briefly imprisoned and subjected to harsh beatings before being released. Upon returning home, Lawrence nearly entered into matrimony. He had known a woman named Janet Laurie since childhood, and they were longtime family friends. One day, Lawrence surprised Janet by proposing marriage, an offer she promptly declined. This incident marks the only known romantic involvement Lawrence ever had with a woman. Biographers suggest that Lawrence may have viewed intimacy with suspicion or discomfort, preferring instead the camaraderie of his male companions. When World War I erupted in 1914, Lawrence did not immediately enlist, only joining the ranks a couple of months after the conflict began. Due to his linguistic and cultural skills, he was appointed to the intelligence office in Cairo as a lieutenant interpreter. There he became involved in the efforts against the Turks, who had allied themselves with the Germans. Despite being at war, Lawrence spent 1915 engaged in somewhat routine office duties in Cairo. His primary tasks included creating maps, interrogating prisoners, and compiling daily bulletins for commanders in the field. However, he was soon pleased to learn that tribes in Arabia had initiated a rebellion against the Turks. A staunch advocate for Arab independence, Lawrence was eager to find a means to assist. Recognizing an opportunity to disrupt the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, British intelligence understood they needed to establish contact with the Arab tribal chieftains leading the revolt and provide them with military assistance. They required an emissary possessing extensive knowledge of Arabian culture and geography, and Lawrence was the ideal candidate. Lawrence journeyed to the port of Jeddah and met the British consul there. He also encountered Prince Abdullah, a potential leader for the revolt. Though Lawrence was impressed by Abdullah, he was more intrigued by Abdullah's enigmatic brother, Prince Faisal, who was encamped with his fighters 100 miles further inland. Lawrence prepared himself for an overland Arabian trek to meet Prince Faisal. Donning a headscarf for sun protection and riding a camel, Lawrence embarked into the desert. After a 100-mile journey, he finally reached the camp and was immediately captivated by Faisal Hussein, whose commanding presence inspired unwavering loyalty among his men. Lawrence became convinced that Faisal could effectively lead a revolt against the Turks. Despite being initially cautious of outsiders, Faisal appreciated Lawrence's understanding of the intricate nomadic culture of the Bedouins. Upon returning to Arabia, Lawrence became proficient with explosives, quickly mastering the handling of various cords, detonators, and dynamite sticks. He recognized that the Middle East, for millennia, had been a region centered around cities and that severing rail communications between these cities would significantly weaken Turkish forces. Prince Faisal concurred with Lawrence's strategy of widespread railway sabotage. Lawrence first experienced combat when he planted mines on the track leading to Medina, detonating a lengthy section of rail and destroying a locomotive. The operation proved successful, impacting Ottoman operations in the region. While consulting with Prince Faisal on railway sabotage, Lawrence had the opportunity to meet Auda Abu Tai, leader of the Hawitat tribe. This warlord had spent most of his life engaged in tribal desert warfare and was eager to attack the Turks. Lawrence was delighted to discover that Auda shared many of his strategic beliefs. They agreed to combine forces to advance their plans. Lawrence and Auda had to traverse some of the most desolate terrain in Arabia, encountering and uniting with other Arab tribes along their path. Lawrence reached the limits of his endurance in the extreme conditions. On one occasion, Lawrence noticed a riderless camel. The missing man was unpopular with the group, and many considered his disappearance inconsequential. However, Lawrence rode his camel back for an hour and a half before finally locating and rescuing the lost man. Although the Arabs regarded Lawrence with a mix of bewilderment, it became evident that he had earned their respect through his actions. During a skirmish in July 1917, Auda ordered a camel charge to seize the city of Aqaba. But upon reaching the Turkish lines, his animal collapsed beneath him. It turned out that Lawrence had inadvertently shot his camel in the back of the head. Despite this mishap, Aqaba was successfully captured. The capture of Aqaba in July 1917 was a pivotal moment in the Arab revolt. It opened a vital supply route for British support and brought Lawrence into greater prominence. After the victory, he embarked on a grueling ride of over 150 miles across the desert to deliver the news in person to British command in Egypt. There he was hailed as a hero. The newspapers, already fascinated by the mystique of the revolt, began calling him Lawrence of Arabia, a nickname he would never fully escape. Lawrence's campaign gained momentum, and with Faisal's army growing in size and confidence, their raids on Turkish infrastructure escalated. Lawrence became adept at guerrilla tactics, blowing up railway lines, ambushing supply trains, and sowing confusion deep behind enemy lines. These hit-and-run attacks crippled Turkish mobility and morale. But while Lawrence appeared outwardly committed to the revolt, internally he was torn by guilt and doubt. He had grown close to Faisal and the Arab fighters, yet he knew of the secret Sykes-Picot agreement. In November 1917, a mission went awry. Lawrence was captured by Turkish forces in the town of Daraa. In his later writings, he claimed he was beaten, possibly tortured, and may have been sexually assaulted during his captivity. The event marked a turning point. Although he escaped and rejoined the revolt, the trauma and shame remained with him. His writings became darker, filled with self-loathing. Biographers have suggested that this episode cemented his sense of alienation from both British military command and his Arab allies. Despite his personal turmoil, Lawrence pressed forward. With Faisal's army and British support under General Allenby, the Arab revolt pushed north. Lawrence led daring raids through Syria, eventually reaching Damascus in October 1918. Yet instead of the triumphant climax he had envisioned, Lawrence was devastated. Faisal's troops, having reached the city first, were sidelined as British and French officials moved in to assert control. Lawrence's dream of an independent Arab state, one he had fought and bled for, was slipping away. In the months following the war, Lawrence accompanied Faisal to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, where they lobbied in vain for Arab independence. Lawrence spoke passionately on behalf of his former comrades, but geopolitical interests prevailed. France was granted control of Syria, dashing Faisal's hopes of ruling there. Though he was later made king of Iraq with British backing, the dream of a unified Arab kingdom died in Paris. Disillusioned, Lawrence withdrew from public life. He refused medals and titles and even rejected a knighthood from King George V. Seeking anonymity, he changed his name several times, enlisting in the Royal Air Force and later the British Army under aliases. He found a strange solace in the discipline of military life, performing mundane duties far from the spotlight. But he could never fully escape his fame. Reporters pursued him relentlessly, and even his fellow soldiers recognized the gaunt figure, with the piercing eyes and the haunted expression. Lawrence's legacy following the war was as complicated and multifaceted as the man himself. Struggling with post-war trauma, he became increasingly disillusioned with fame, politics, and his own identity. Though he was heralded as a war hero and even mythologized in books and newspapers, Lawrence recoiled from the limelight. He had witnessed the horrors of modern warfare and bore the psychological scars of his actions and the consequences of British imperial deceit. Despite being admired by the public and receiving praise from military and political elites, Lawrence often referred to himself as a fraud. In 1921, Winston Churchill, then colonial secretary, appointed Lawrence as an advisor on Arab affairs in the newly formed Middle East Department. Despite his aversion to politics, Lawrence accepted the offer out of loyalty to King Faisal and a hope that he could still influence British policy for the benefit of Arab autonomy. At the Cairo conference that year, Lawrence played a key role in shaping the modern political landscape of the region, helping to establish Faisal as King of Iraq and Abdullah, Faisal's brother, as Emir of Transjordan. This marked one of the few tangible victories Lawrence achieved in post-war diplomacy. And although it did not bring full independence to the Arab people, it granted a degree of local governance and influence that might otherwise have been denied. Yet Lawrence remained uneasy. He viewed the entire geopolitical settlement as a compromise at best and a betrayal at worst. The promises of full Arab sovereignty that had been made during the war were ignored or diluted. As European powers imposed borders and mandates upon the region, they ignored the cultural, tribal, and religious complexities of the Middle East. Lawrence foresaw that this arbitrary division of lands would eventually lead to long-term instability and conflict, a prediction that would prove chillingly accurate in the decades to follow. Lawrence's discomfort with his public image was profound. He adopted several pseudonyms after the war, including T.E. Shaw, under which he enlisted in the Royal Air Force and later the Royal Tank Corps. In these roles, he sought anonymity and simplicity. He welcomed the harsh discipline and physical rigor of military life, finding in it a kind of penance for the psychological burden he carried. His attempts at anonymity were often thwarted, however, as journalists and curious admirers frequently uncovered his true identity. He lived frugally in modest quarters, writing extensively and corresponding with influential figures such as George Bernard Shaw, E.M. Forster, and Robert Graves. His letters reveal a man of introspection, humor, and deep personal conflict. He often expressed his inner turmoil about loyalty, honor, and the moral ambiguity of his wartime actions. Lawrence's fascination with personal sacrifice and denial was mirrored in his daily life. He rejected wealth and comfort and embraced solitude. Though Lawrence had distanced himself from politics, he kept a watchful eye on the Middle East. He corresponded regularly with King Faisal, offering support and advice even as British influence continued to overshadow local authority. Despite his official retirement from diplomacy, Lawrence was still consulted on matters relating to the region. a testament to the respect he commanded in both Arab and British circles. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, Lawrence continued to write, most notably working on revising his magnum opus, 7 Pillars of Wisdom. This autobiographical account of the Arab Revolt is both a personal confession and a sweeping narrative of military strategy, desert life, and cross-cultural alliance. The first privately printed edition appeared in 1926, and it was a lavishly illustrated volume distributed to a small group of supporters and friends. Lawrence's perfectionism ensured that multiple versions were rewritten and edited, with each iteration attempting to balance literary elegance with factual precision. What sets 7 Pillars of Wisdom apart is its depth of introspection. Far from a typical war memoir, the work examines the psychological toll of leadership and the blurred lines between loyalty and manipulation. Lawrence did not portray himself as a hero. Instead, he described the emotional torment he experienced, the ethical dilemmas he faced, and the guilt that haunted him. He saw the desert not just as a theater of war, but as a landscape of the soul, both liberating and isolating. During this period, Lawrence also formed significant friendships with members of the British literary and intellectual elite. He visited the home of Thomas Hardy, corresponded with T.S. Eliot, and maintained a long-standing friendship with Charlotte Shaw, the wife of George Bernard Shaw. These relationships offered him a kind of intellectual refuge and affirmed his place in British cultural life, even as he distanced himself from public acclaim. Despite his quiet lifestyle, Lawrence remained an object of fascination. Journalists speculated about his private life, including his sexuality, which remained a topic of mystery and debate. Lawrence never married, and while some biographers have suggested intimate attachments, most notably with the whom, no definitive evidence has ever confirmed a romantic or sexual relationship. Lawrence himself guarded his privacy fiercely, often deflecting personal questions and maintaining a veil of ambiguity. By the early 1930s, Lawrence seemed to find a measure of peace. He had finished his major works, enjoyed a close circle of friends, and lived a relatively content life at Clouds Hill, his cottage in Dorset. The small, unassuming house was a reflection of his inner world, sparse, private, and full of carefully chosen books and objects. It was here that Lawrence found moments of solace away from the demands of society. Tragically, his quietude would be short-lived. On May 13, 1935, while riding his Brew Superior motorcycle near his home, Lawrence swerved to avoid 2 boys on bicycles and crashed. He suffered severe head injuries and died 6 days later, on May 19th, at the age of 46. His funeral, held at St. Nicholas Church in Morton, was attended by a host of dignitaries, writers, and friends. Winston Churchill, who had long admired Lawrence, remarked that he had left the world a better place by the beauty of his actions and the nobility of his spirit. In the years following his death, Lawrence's legacy grew even larger. He became the subject of numerous books, films, and academic studies. The 1962 film Lawrence of Arabia, directed by David Lean and starring Peter O'Toole, immortalized him for a new generation, though it also blurred the lines between fact and fiction. The film's sweeping desert landscapes, haunting score, and intense emotional drama captured the imagination of millions, even as historians debated its historical accuracy. Today, T.E. Lawrence remains an enigmatic figure. He defied categorization: soldier, scholar, diplomat, writer, and rebel. He was deeply flawed and profoundly brilliant, torn between empire and idealism, loyalty and betrayal, self-promotion and self-denial. His impact on the modern Middle East remains deeply relevant, as does his exploration of identity, power, and the human cost of war. Despite recurring bouts of depression and restlessness, Lawrence maintained closer relationships with a small circle of friends, including Winston Churchill. He continued to write, tinker with motorcycles, and pursue solitude in the countryside. In 1935, just 2 months after retiring from the Royal Air Force, Lawrence was involved in a motorcycle accident near his cottage in Dorset. He swerved to avoid 2 boys on bicycles and crashed. He died 6 days later from head injuries at the age of 46. At his funeral, Churchill remarked, "I fear whatever our need, we shall never see his like again."